June 6th, 1944. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the coast of Normandy. From the bluffs above the sea, German soldiers peer through the mist, their eyes narrowed against the wind. They have been awake all night, listening to distant engines rolling like thunder beyond the horizon. Inside the concrete bunkers, MG-42 machine guns rest on their tripods, barrels oiled, ammunition belts neatly coiled. The men of the 352nd Infantry Division wait in silence. Then, faintly, the fog parts. A dark line appears on the water, then another, and another. It stretches farther than the eye can see. Hundreds of ships. Thousands. At first, the German gunners laugh. They believe it is impossible. No army could land here, not on this exposed beach of open sand and steep cliffs. They think it's another Allied diversion, a feint before the real attack elsewhere. Their officers assure them the Atlantic Wall is impregnable. But as the sky fills with the sound of engines, the laughter begins to fade. The invasion has begun, and the men on those cliffs are about to face something they cannot stop. The storm of Normandy has finally arrived, and it begins right here, on Omaha Beach. 4 years before that dawn at Omaha Beach, Adolf Hitler had ordered a wall to be built. Not a wall of stone or steel, but of fear. Stretching from the fjords of Norway to the sands of the Bay of Biscay, it was called the Atlantic Wall. Bunkers, minefields, gun batteries, and machine gun nests lined more than 2,000 miles of coastline. It was meant to make Europe an unbreakable fortress. Hitler promised that if the Allies ever tried to invade the continent, they would be thrown back into the sea. But by 1944, the war had turned against Germany. The Soviet Union was pushing from the east. Italy had fallen. In the west, the Allies prepared for their return to Europe. The invasion would be the largest amphibious assault in history, yet to succeed, it needed surprise and deception. British and American intelligence created an elaborate illusion known as Operation Fortitude. Fake armies were stationed across England with dummy tanks and wooden aircraft. Radio transmissions spoke of a massive invasion targeting Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel. German reconnaissance aircraft saw what they were meant to see, an army waiting opposite Calais. Normandy, by comparison, seemed quiet, unimportant, and far too risky. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been placed in charge of defending the French coast. Unlike many of his peers, he understood what modern air power and naval artillery could do. He believed the Allies must be defeated on the beaches within the first hours of landing. If they gained a foothold, Germany would lose France. He ordered miles of obstacles planted in the sand. Steel hedgehogs, mines, wooden stakes tipped with explosives, all designed to crush landing craft or impale tanks before they could reach dry land. But Rommel's warnings were only partly heeded. The High Command in Berlin believed the invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy. Many of the best divisions were stationed hundreds of kilometers away. Even within the 352nd Infantry Division guarding Omaha Beach, there was a mix of veterans and inexperienced troops. They were under strength, spread thin, and lacking proper supplies. Still, they trusted the Atlantic Wall. The German machine gunners stationed above Omaha were confident. Their MG-42s, the backbone of German infantry firepower, could fire up to 200 rounds per minute, more than twice the rate of most Allied weapons. Each bunker was built with intersecting lines of fire that covered every inch of sand below. To the soldiers manning them, it felt like a trap that no army could survive. Across the Channel, Allied planners knew Omaha would be the hardest beach to take. It was the most heavily fortified, with steep bluffs overlooking the shoreline and few natural exits inland. Yet it lay between two critical landing zones, Utah to the west and Gold to the east. If Omaha failed, the invasion front would break apart. The decision to assign the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, and the inexperienced 29th Infantry Division to that sector came after months of deliberation. These men had trained for years, rehearsing landings, storming mock beaches, learning to navigate chaos. But no training could fully prepare them for what waited in Normandy. On the night of June 5, 1944, the weather turned violent. Winds lashed the sea, waves rose like walls. General Eisenhower considered postponing the invasion again. His meteorologists warned of poor visibility and dangerous tides. Yet there was a brief window, one break in the storm. Eisenhower took the risk. "Okay, let's go," he said. As dawn approached, more than 5,000 ships, battleships, transports, and landing craft crossed the English Channel. In the dark, German lookouts heard the rumble, but could not believe its scale. Some thought it was a convoy heading elsewhere. Others assumed it was the same nightly bombardment that had harassed them for months. No alarm was raised until the horizon began to glow with the silhouettes of ships. The men in the bunkers rubbed sleep from their eyes, peered through periscopes, and saw the impossible. An entire armada moving toward them. The Allies had come. But to the Germans it still seemed manageable. They believed they could stop it. They didn't yet understand that this morning would mark the beginning of the end, not just for them, but for the entire German war machine. The first shells screamed overhead, and the Atlantic Wall came alive. In the early hours before dawn, the English Channel churned beneath an overcast sky. The men packed into landing craft had been seasick for hours, drenched in salt water and fear. For the Americans of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, this was the moment they had trained for, yet nothing about it felt heroic. They could hear the dull boom of naval guns pounding the French coast. Every blast sent shockwaves through the sea, rattling the steel hulls around them. Above, transport aircraft droned steadily toward the mainland, carrying paratroopers bound for the hedgerows beyond the beaches. The invasion of Europe had begun, but at Omaha, it would become something far darker than anyone expected. Omaha Beach stretched for about 6 miles between Vierville-sur-Mer and Colleville-sur-Mer. Unlike other landing zones, it was hemmed in by high bluffs, with only a handful of narrow exits leading inland. The tide rose quickly, leaving little room for maneuver. Offshore sandbars created a deadly trap for landing craft, forcing them to unload men hundreds of yards from the beach under direct fire. To make matters worse, the bombardment meant to soften German defenses had failed. Heavy cloud cover obscured visibility, and most of the naval shells fell too far inland. When the Americans arrived, the bunkers and machine gun nests were still intact, and waiting. Behind the bluffs, the German 352nd Infantry Division, under General Dietrich Kreis, had spent months fortifying its sector. Unlike many coastal units, this division contained seasoned veterans from the Eastern Front. They were supported by local defense battalions composed of older men and conscripts from occupied countries. Their positions had been carefully surveyed and registered for artillery fire. They knew the range of every approach and had pre-sighted their guns on the sand. Every obstacle on the beach was covered by crossfire. The Allies had underestimated them. Intelligence believed only a token force defended Omaha, not a full-strength division. This misjudgment would cost thousands of lives within hours. The night before the landings, rain and wind scattered the invasion fleet. Some landing craft became separated, others sank. The first waves were disorganized before they even saw the shore. Engineers carrying demolition charges drowned under the weight of their gear. Radios shorted out from seawater. Commanders lost contact with their units. The carefully planned timetable collapsed almost instantly. At 5:30 a.m., Allied battleships opened fire. The sea erupted with flame and thunder. For 30 minutes, the horizon glowed with explosions. But inside their bunkers, most German gunners survived. The concrete casemates were built to withstand direct hits. When the shelling stopped, they climbed back to their positions, peering through firing slits at the smoke-shrouded water below. Then came the sound they would never forget, the roar of engines and the sight of hundreds of landing craft emerging from the haze. The first wave of Americans, about 1,150 men, was approaching. To the Germans, it seemed like suicide. They watched as the small boats struggled through rough surf, many already drifting off course. In the bunkers, the machine gunners checked their belts, loaded fresh drums, and waited for the signal. To the Americans inside those craft, time slowed. Some prayed quietly. Others stared blankly at the ramp in front of them, knowing that when it dropped, there would be no cover. As they neared the shore, German artillery began to find its range. Shells exploded in the water, flipping boats and scattering bodies. The survivors pushed forward, choking on fumes and seawater. The order came, "Lower ramps." When the first ramps dropped, the world turned into hell. MG-42 fire ripped through the air at over 1,000 rounds per minute. Men fell instantly, cut down before they could move. Those who jumped overboard sank under the weight of their packs. A few crawled to the shingle, pressed flat against the sand, unable to lift their heads. From above, the German gunners laughed, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. They had never seen anything like it. The entire beach seemed filled with targets, and their guns were cutting through them as easily as grass under a scythe. The Atlantic Wall was doing its job. For the Americans, every second felt endless. Officers were killed before giving orders. Medics died trying to crawl toward the wounded. The tide turned red and kept rising. Yet amid the chaos, small groups began to move again. They had no radio contact, no leadership, but survival drove them forward. Behind the lines, more landing craft were already approaching. 34,000 more men were on their way. And as the Germans reloaded their guns, still convinced the battle was theirs, the invasion of Western Europe had only just begun. The human cost of Omaha Beach began before the first rifle fired. For the German machine gunners stationed above the sand, life had become a routine of waiting and watching. Most were young men, barely out of their teens, pulled from Bavarian villages or Saxon towns. They had fought on the Eastern Front, seen cities burned and comrades torn apart, and now they faced an unfamiliar enemy across the sea. Many carried the fatigue of months of drilling, constant alertness, and undernourishment. Their hands, calloused from constant loading of ammunition, trembled slightly when they knew the first boats were approaching. There was fear behind the bravado, but also a deep confidence. These men believed their position was unassailable. They had studied maps, trained their eyes on the surf, and measured every trajectory. For them, the Atlantic Wall was a guardian, and their weapons were instruments of inevitability. Tactically, Omaha was a fortress in miniature. The beach was divided into sectors, each dominated by a network of bunkers and trenches, fortified with barbed wire and anti-tank obstacles. MG-42 nests were placed on the bluffs to provide overlapping fields of fire, creating kill zones along the sand. Mortar positions were camouflaged to blend with the cliffs. Mines, both anti-personnel and anti-vehicle, were embedded just below the tide line, invisible until stepped upon. Each gunner had a designated sector. The Germans had practiced coordination so that even if one bunker was destroyed, the fire from another would immediately compensate. Lines of sight were measured precisely, with range-finding instruments ensuring that each sweep of machine gun fire could catch waves of attackers with minimal adjustment. This network created a killing ground that, on paper, was nearly perfect. Technology amplified human efficiency. The MG-42, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw by Allied soldiers, was central to the German defensive doctrine. It could fire up to 200 rounds per minute, forcing soldiers to hit the deck or risk instant death. Ammunition belts were long enough to maintain near-constant fire, while the weapon's recoil management allowed sustained bursts without losing accuracy. Its mechanical design was simple, reliable, and brutal. To the men operating it, it was not just a gun. It was a force multiplier. One nest could mow down dozens of men in seconds. Its reputation alone struck fear into those who had trained to approach beaches under enemy fire. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. Soldiers on the sand described the sound as a continuous scream, a shrill roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and that relentless noise would shape the memory of D-Day for anyone who survived. From the enemy's perspective, the Americans facing Omaha were entering an abyss. The first wave, primarily composed of soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division, had rehearsed countless drills for landings like this. Yet training could never replicate the sensation of being pinned down under machine gun fire, artillery shells exploding in the surf, and friends falling beside you with no warning. Visibility was poor, boats were scattered by currents and shell fire, and chaos reigned. Many soldiers lost their officers within minutes, leaving squads without leadership. Panic threatened to spread, but the men pressed on. Some crawled forward under cover of the beach's uneven terrain, using the broken wooden obstacles for minimal protection. Others, frozen by shock, could only lie flat and pray. Survival instincts overrode doctrine, yet even with courage, the first wave was largely decimated. Leadership played a critical role on both sides, or its absence shaped events. General Kreis, overseeing the 352nd Infantry Division, had spent weeks inspecting fortifications and drilling his men, but command decisions could not account for every variable. Some German positions had been reinforced, while others were thinly manned. Officers in the bunkers coordinated fire with precision, but chaos could always disrupt communication. On the American side, the loss of officers created gaps in command that scattered units and delayed movement inland. Yet small acts of initiative by non-commissioned officers and privates often became pivotal, allowing tiny groups to find cover, return fire, or signal engineers to clear obstacles. Leadership was tested not just in strategic planning, but in the ability to adapt in real time to the horrors unfolding before very pair of eyes. Morale, too, was an invisible battlefield. The Germans, laughing at the first wave, believed their defenses were unbreakable. That laughter masked anxiety born from long nights of anticipation and the burden of responsibility. Every man knew that failure could mean the collapse of the front, and still, confidence held them steady. Among the Americans, fear was immediate, visceral, and absolute. Yet courage emerged in moments of instinct. Soldiers supported one another, pulled comrades from drowning in the surf, or risked death to drag wounded across the sand. The chaos stripped both sides to a raw confrontation between training, instinct, and survival. Omaha became a crucible of humanity, where fear and determination collided under a sky filled with smoke, fire, and screaming shells. The human, tactical, technological, leadership, and moral dimensions all intertwined in those first hours. The German positions were meticulously prepared, and the men operating them were confident and well-equipped. The Americans faced what appeared to be insurmountable odds, yet the unfolding battle was not just a clash of numbers and firepower, it was a collision of human endurance and will. Each gunner pulling the trigger, each soldier charging the sand, each officer attempting to coordinate amid the noise, created a rhythm of horror and heroism that would define the memory of Omaha. In those early moments, the Germans laughed. Their weapons sang their deadly song, and the first wave of Americans fell. But even as laughter echoed across the bluffs, the knowledge that more soldiers were coming, thousands more, stirred an unease that would grow with every incoming craft. While the first wave of Americans struggled in the surf, the second, third, and subsequent waves were already approaching. From the perspective of the enemy, these men were not faceless invaders but human beings confronting impossible odds. In the landing craft, soldiers clung to the rails, teeth chattering, stomachs turning. They were aware of the machine guns above, of the mines below, and of the chaotic surf threatening to overturn them. Each man carried the weight of training, duty, and fear, along with packs heavy with weapons and equipment. Some whispered prayers, others gritted their teeth silently. Every second felt like an eternity as they drew closer to the beach, yet the relentless arrival of waves made hesitation impossible. Survival depended on moving forward. From a tactical perspective, the Germans had designed Omaha to be a killing field. The MG-42 nests had been positioned to create interlocking zones of fire. Each bunker had an unobstructed line of sight over multiple 100 meters of sand, while hidden mortars and artillery positions supported the machine guns with indirect fire. Obstacles were layered. Wooden stakes, steel hedgehogs, and anti-tank mines created chaos and slowed movement. Crossing these defenses was nearly impossible under concentrated fire. Every inch of the beach was calculated to maximize casualties. Yet the Americans adapted. Small groups began to find gaps, following paths cleared by engineers or the rare misalignment in German fire. Leaders who survived improvised, signaling soldiers to move laterally and converge on weak points. Chaos became opportunity, and adaptability became the measure of survival. Technological superiority was critical on both sides. The Germans relied on the MG-42 for rapid suppression, complemented by mortars, artillery, and pre-sighted rifles. Each weapon was meticulously maintained, designed for reliability and lethal efficiency. The Americans, in turn, used landing craft, demolition charges, flamethrowers, and portable artillery to counteract the German defenses. The Sherman tanks scheduled to arrive on the beach struggled to navigate the obstacles, yet their presence promised the possibility of turning the tide once they reached open ground. Engineering innovations, both defensive and offensive, shaped the battle in ways far more decisive than numbers alone. Technology created a deadly dialogue between the beach and the bluffs, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other under fire. Leadership on Omaha Beach was tested in extremis. The Germans, confident but bound by pre-planned firing sectors, were suddenly forced to react to unanticipated movement from the Americans. Officers tried to direct fire and reload ammunition belts while coordinating with adjacent bunkers, but casualties among their ranks disrupted communication. Some bunkers were destroyed or bypassed, forcing the gunners to shift fire to new sectors. On the American side, surviving leaders quickly improvised command structures. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers assumed responsibility for small groups, signaling with whistles, hand gestures, or shouted commands. Decisions had to be instantaneous, often under direct threat of death. This improvisation became crucial in the struggle to breach the defenses, illustrating that leadership in war is as much about adaptability as it is about planning. Morale fluctuated violently throughout the day. The German soldiers initially believed their firepower was sufficient to repel the invasion entirely. The first wave confirmed their assumptions, but as more troops kept arriving, the laughter that had echoed across the cliffs faded into unease. The realization that the Allies were not deterred by mass casualties unsettled even the most seasoned veterans. Soldiers began to experience cognitive dissonance, the clash between expectation and reality, which would affect their effectiveness as the battle wore on. Conversely, American morale, though battered, was fueled by necessity and shared determination. Soldiers saw their comrades survive or die in plain view, and the need to keep moving, to survive, became a unifying force. Small victories, reaching the first obstacle, clearing a lane, returning fire, built momentum. Courage was contagious, as was despair, and both forces were locked in a psychological struggle as intense as the physical one. The human angle remained central. German gunners were trained to see the beach as a map of targets, yet beneath their composure lay fear of counterattacks, shells, and the unknown. They had witnessed the destructive power of Allied air and naval forces in other campaigns. Some understood that each missed shot could have fatal consequences for their comrades, yet duty required discipline. American soldiers, conversely, faced immediate sensory overload. The roar of the MG-42, the heat of explosions, the smell of cordite and sea salt, and the tactile shock of pulling comrades from the water. Each man made split-second decisions that would determine survival or death, and the intensity of these moments created bonds, often unspoken, between soldiers fighting side by side in conditions too extreme for planning to guide them. The moral dimension of Omaha Beach was complex. German soldiers fired upon men who looked, in many ways, like themselves, young, frightened, and unwilling participants in a war they had not fully chosen. The experience of firing into waves of human beings at close range was harrowing, even for hardened veterans. Conversely, the Americans confronted the moral challenge of advancing, despite knowing the likelihood of death was extremely high. Every step taken, every weapon fired, was an act of both obedience and personal courage. Omaha became a crucible of morality, testing the limits of human endurance, duty, and ethical conflict under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Ultimately, these angles, human, tactical, technological, leadership, enemy, and moral, interwove to define the reality of Omaha Beach. The Germans believed they controlled the fight, their weapons and training superior, their positions impregnable. The Americans, though battered, adaptive, and resolute, would not yield. The collision of these forces created a moment in history that was chaotic, brutal, and transformative. As the day progressed, the laughter of the German gunners gave way to disbelief. They began to understand that no single weapon, bunker, or plan could stop the tide of soldiers determined to reach the cliffs above. The beach, designed as a trap, became a battlefield defined by improvisation, courage, and the unyielding momentum of an army committed to survival. By mid-morning, the dynamics on the beach had begun to shift. German gunners who had laughed at the first wave now faced the reality of relentless human waves advancing through the chaos. The tactical, technological, and human elements collided with deadly force, producing both tragedy and heroism in equal measure. Omaha Beach had become a crucible, and those who survived would carry the memory of what unfolded into the history books. By 6:30 a.m., the first wave of Americans at Omaha Beach had been almost completely annihilated. Men lay sprawled across the sand, their bodies pinned by MG-42 fire or torn apart by mines and artillery. The roar of machine guns seemed endless, a mechanical scream that echoed from the bluffs to the surf. In the bunkers, the German gunners initially felt vindicated. They had studied this terrain, honed their aim, and witnessed the first wave crumble exactly as planned. Laughter rippled through the concrete fortifications, a nervous but real expression of triumph. They believed the beach was theirs, that the Americans had no hope of gaining even a foothold. Yet this confidence was the first sign of their miscalculation. Behind the chaos, more landing craft approached. The second wave, and soon the third, poured into the surf, hundreds at a time. Naval bombardment, which had seemed inadequate before, now began to take a toll. Some bunkers were hit, machine guns silenced, and defensive lines fractured. The Americans who survived the first wave clambered over obstacles, dragging themselves to the relative safety of shallow ditches or behind wrecked landing craft. Small pockets of resistance began to push inland, often led by men who had lost their officers in the initial onslaught but had not lost their determination. The tide of men was relentless. By 7:15 a.m., the Germans could no longer laugh. Their previous calculations, that a single wave could halt the invasion, were unraveling. MG-42 crews fired continuously, belts emptying faster than they could reload. Ammunition shortages began to emerge, and fatigue set in. The realization spread. The Americans were not stopping. Every burst of gunfire seemed only to thin the incoming ranks, not halt them. Commanders shouted orders, coordinating fire between bunkers, but the noise, smoke, and chaos made precise coordination nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the Americans adapted to the nightmare. Individual soldiers took initiative. Corpses were used as cover. Fallen landing craft became shields. Engineers braved enemy fire to clear obstacle. With Bangalore torpedoes, creating narrow paths through the maze of stakes, mines, and hedgehogs. Some small squads managed to reach the seawall at Vieuville-sur-Mer, scaling cliffs under heavy fire. They improvised handholds, used ropes, and climbed sheer faces where no man should survive. Each success emboldened others. Courage spread contagiously, turning fear into purpose. At 8 a.m., the first Sherman tanks reached the shore, though delayed by underwater obstacles and concentrated gunfire. Their cannons were limited in effect at first, but even the sight of armored vehicles rolling across the sand forced German gunners to adjust, splitting attention and reducing the efficiency of their fire. The beach, designed to trap and annihilate the invaders, began to feel less absolute. By mid-morning, around 9:30 a.m., the American presence on the beach had multiplied exponentially. Surviving infantry groups, supported by engineers and armor, began to link up. Small footholds were established behind the seawall. The Germans, though still in strong positions, faced an enemy that no longer fit the narrative of a single doomed wave. Every passing minute made clear that if they did not adapt, their strong points could be isolated and destroyed. Command chaos intensified among the Germans. Some bunkers ran low on ammunition, others were partially destroyed by naval bombardment. Officers shouted in vain over the din of artillery and machine guns. Soldiers who had been confident now questioned their ability to hold. Fear began to erode the initial bravado. Laughter was replaced with tense silence, punctuated by the mechanical roar of MG-42s and the cries of wounded men. At the same time, the human element became decisive. American soldiers moved in ways the Germans had not anticipated. Small teams scaled cliffs previously deemed impassable. They attacked pillboxes from the flanks, using grenades and satchel charges to neutralize positions. The combination of determination, improvisation, and relentless pressure began to fracture the German defense. By 10 a.m., the tide of battle had shifted enough that the previously confident defenders recognized they might not hold the beach. By 11 a.m., the once unbreakable Atlantic wall at Omaha was under severe stress. German gunners, exhausted and increasingly demoralized, could no longer dominate the sand with the same precision. Waves of Americans continued to arrive, reinforcing the footholds and slowly expanding the beachhead. The laughter that had greeted the first wave had long since vanished, replaced with grim determination to survive, fight, and adapt to the reality of a battle that had become far larger and more chaotic than any plan could have predicted. In these hours, the decisive elements of Omaha Beach became clear. Relentless pressure, improvisation under fire, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the human will to endure. The first wave had seemed like a footnote, easily repelled, but the unceasing arrival of additional troops turned that initial triumph into a warning. By late morning, the German line was cracking under pressure that no bunker, no machine gun, and no defensive plan could fully contain. The first wave was no longer the measure of the battle. The tide of 34,000 men had arrived, and Omaha Beach was no longer a trap. It was the site of an extraordinary test of endurance, strategy, and human resolve. By noon, Omaha Beach had become a maelstrom of violence and chaos. The initial German confidence, which had erupted in laughter as the first wave hit the sand, had been replaced by an urgent tension. MG-42 crews, once calm and precise, were now exhausted, firing relentlessly while trying to reload belts faster than the incoming tide of Americans could be counted. Concrete bunkers, designed to withstand naval bombardment, had taken hits that left walls cracked and firing slits shattered. The Americans had gained small pockets of relative safety, and from these footholds, soldiers pushed forward with determination fueled by survival instinct. The second, third, and subsequent waves pressed relentlessly. Engineers cleared lanes through hedgehogs and stakes, often under direct fire. Small squads, having lost officers, adapted with improvisation, crawling from cover to cover, returning fire whenever possible. The German gunners attempted to maintain interlocking fields of fire, but the concentrated arrival of men and material stretched every defensive sector. Some bunkers were silenced by naval artillery, others were assaulted by hand grenades and satchel charges, forcing gunners to retreat or face annihilation. The beach, meant to be a trap that could halt an army, became a grinding battlefield of attrition. Around 1 p.m., the first Americans reached the bluffs behind the beach. Scaling cliffs thought impassable under fire, they began attacking the German positions from above and the sides. Gunners who had felt invincible now faced threats from directions they had considered safe. The psychological impact was immediate. Panic began to seep into the ranks. Soldiers shouted in confusion, officers attempted to coordinate fire through smoke and debris, and ammunition shortages became critical. The American naval forces intensified bombardment. Destroyers targeted reinforced bunkers, while cruisers fired heavier shells inland, disrupting German artillery support. Tanks, although slowed by obstacles, arrived to provide direct fire support. Their cannons and machine guns forced German troops to seek cover, reducing the volume of incoming fire and allowing American infantry to advance further. The beach, once a killing zone, was beginning to yield to the combined pressure of coordinated infantry, armor, and engineering teams. By mid-afternoon, around 2:30 p.m., the German defensive line along Omaha Beach was visibly fracturing. MG-42 crews, previously capable of mowing down entire waves, were forced to abandon positions as American soldiers breached bunkers and neutralized machine guns from close range. Some gunners attempted to fire from secondary positions, but ammunition ran low, communication lines had been destroyed, and exhaustion impaired reaction times. The tactical advantage that the Germans had relied upon for months was slipping away, replaced by the raw momentum of American determination. Leadership failures on both sides became starkly apparent. On the German side, officers who had survived early shelling struggled to maintain command. The loss of adjacent bunkers left sectors undefended, and soldiers without orders faced paralyzing uncertainty. Conversely, American leadership, initially scattered by the first wave's losses, had evolved. Junior officers and enlisted men improvised chains of command, directing men to weak points, marking cleared paths through obstacles, and coordinating with armor and naval fire. The ability to adapt dynamically became decisive, highlighting that leadership under fire was less about planning and more about immediate action. Human endurance defined the battle at this point. Soldiers on both sides experienced extreme fatigue, dehydration, and shock. The Germans faced waves of men advancing relentlessly. The Americans had endured firestorms, drowning, and destruction of their landing craft. Yet in the chaos, courage persisted. Americans pressed forward, often dragging wounded comrades, scaling cliffs, and neutralizing machine gun nests at point-blank range. Germans, despite the collapse of their tactical advantage, fought fiercely, firing until belts were empty and taking cover only when survival demanded. Omaha Beach had become a test of human will as much as of strategy or technology. By 3:30 p.m., the German defenders understood the reality. Their positions were no longer tenable. Key bunkers had fallen, gaps in the line allowed American soldiers to penetrate inland, and the tide of reinforcements continued to arrive. The once confident machine gunners who had laughed at the first wave now faced exhaustion, fear, and the collapse of the defensive illusion. What had been a controlled killing field had transformed into a chaotic battlefield in which the initiative belonged to the attackers. The final hours of the day saw American units consolidate their gains. Survivors from the first waves regrouped with later arrivals, creating cohesive forces capable of advancing toward inland exits. Engineers cleared critical paths, allowing tanks and artillery to move forward and provide support. German resistance, while still deadly, had lost coordination and control. The Atlantic Wall, a symbol of invincibility, was no longer a guarantee of victory. By evening, the scale of Omaha Beach's transformation was evident. Thousands of Americans had reached the bluffs. Bunkers that once dominated the sand were either destroyed or abandoned. The German defenders, having fought valiantly, were retreating to secondary positions, often under pursuit. The initial laughter, once a mark of overconfidence and belief in invulnerability, had vanished entirely, replaced with grim acceptance of the battlefield's brutal reality. The events of this day would become emblematic of D-Day, a combination of meticulous planning, individual courage, improvisation under fire, and the relentless momentum of human determination. Omaha Beach had resisted, inflicted devastating losses, and tested the limits of all who fought there. Yet, by the end of June 6th, the beach had been secured by the Allies, demonstrating that even the strongest fortifications could not withstand perseverance, coordination, and unyielding courage. The first wave had been laughed at, almost annihilated, but the tide of 34,000 men had arrived. Omaha Beach had been transformed from a killing zone into the first foothold of a larger campaign that would eventually liberate Western Europe. The laughter of German machine gunners had been silenced, replaced by the grim reality of a defensive line under relentless assault and the beginning of the end for the Atlantic Wall. By nightfall on June 6th, Omaha Beach had been claimed by the Americans, but the cost was staggering. Thousands of men lay dead or wounded along the sand and in shallow waters. Entire companies had been decimated in minutes, their names recorded in casualty reports that would haunt military archives and personal letters for decades. The beach itself was a scene of chaos. Destroyed landing craft, overturned tanks, shattered obstacles, and scattered equipment marked every foot of sand. Smoke hung in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder and seawater. The once confident German machine gunners had retreated to secondary positions inland, many shaken by the unrelenting waves of Americans they had underestimated. The surviving German defenders faced both tactical and psychological consequences. Their positions, designed to dominate the beach, had been systematically neutralized or bypassed. MG-42 crews, who had laughed at the first wave, now confronted the realization that the Atlantic Wall was not invincible. Orders from higher command urged reorganization, but communication lines had been disrupted by naval bombardment and infantry advances. Soldiers were exhausted, morale had plummeted, and fear replaced overconfidence. Many retreated under fire, leaving gaps that American troops exploited to push inland. For the Americans, the victory came at a horrific price. The U.S. 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions suffered their highest casualties on D-Day. Reports documented over 2,000 killed and nearly 5,000 wounded in the Omaha sector alone. Yet these numbers do not fully capture the chaos of the day, the countless near misses, the drowned soldiers swept away by the surf, and the comrades carried to safety only, through extraordinary courage. Small squads, improvising and adapting, had created the first footholds that would allow the Allies to continue the invasion of Normandy. The engineers played a pivotal role in the aftermath. They cleared paths through minefields and obstacles, enabling the movement of tanks, artillery, and additional troops. Naval forces continued to provide fire support to suppress remaining German positions, while air units bombed inland to disrupt reinforcements. By evening, a tenuous but critical connection had been established between the beachhead and inland roads, providing the Allies with supply routes and the ability to consolidate gains. Omaha Beach had become a microcosm of the larger invasion, a testament to the human cost of war, the effectiveness of preparation, and the unpredictable nature of battle. The German defenders, trained and equipped, had relied on fortifications, superior firepower, and tactical advantage. Yet the Americans, through persistence, improvisation, and sheer determination, had turned a trap into an opportunity. The first wave, nearly destroyed, was no longer the defining moment. It was the continuous pressure of thousands more men arriving that fractured German resolve and transformed the battlefield. By night, the Atlantic Wall along Omaha had been breached, and German forces faced a grim choice: attempt to regroup under constant pressure or retreat further inland to avoid encirclement. Their defensive strategy, once thought unassailable, had failed in hours. The psychological impact on the soldiers and officers was profound. Many would carry the memory of this failure for the rest of the war, understanding that meticulous planning and superior firepower could not compensate for human perseverance and adaptability. The beach, now littered with debris and bodies, stood as a stark symbol of sacrifice and resilience. For WWII allies, it was the first step in the liberation of Western Europe, a hard-won foothold that would serve as a base for the months of advance to come. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of the unraveling of their Atlantic defenses. The laughter of machine gunners had been silenced by the relentless tide of soldiers willing to endure unimaginable horrors to achieve their objective. Omaha Beach was no longer a theoretical stronghold. It had become a battlefield defined by courage, chaos, and the harsh realities of war. In the hours following the securing of Omaha Beach, the full scale of destruction became evident. The sand was strewn with the detritus of battle, smashed landing craft, twisted metal obstacles, and the remnants of vehicles sunk in the surf. Fires smoldered along the shoreline where naval shells had ignited wooden structures and supplies. Medics moved frantically among the wounded, often under sporadic machine gun and sniper fire. Casualty numbers, already staggering, continued to climb as soldiers succumbed to injuries, exposure, or drowning. The human cost was enormous, but for the Allied command, the beachhead represented a critical foothold, one that would allow reinforcements, supplies, and armor to arrive, sustaining the momentum of the larger invasion. For the German forces, the day was a catastrophic turning point. The 352nd Infantry Division, initially confident in its preparation and firepower, had suffered devastating losses. Many officers had been killed or incapacitated, leaving small groups of soldiers isolated and without coordination. Communication lines were disrupted by naval bombardment, artillery, and the chaos of constant engagement. Retreating inland, the German defenders struggled to reorganize, often facing American patrols and artillery fire. The myth of the Atlantic Wall's invincibility was shattered, leaving both soldiers and commanders to confront the reality that their carefully constructed defenses could not withstand the scale and determination of the Allied assault. The psychological impact on German leadership was profound. Field Marshal Rommel, who had predicted the dangers of relying solely on fortifications, reportedly reacted with frustration and disbelief. Hitler himself was informed of the failures at Omaha, though his understanding of the tactical situation was limited by incomplete reports and propaganda filtered through multiple levels of command. The breach at Omaha demonstrated that even the strongest positions, when faced with sustained human determination and adaptability, were vulnerable. American forces, meanwhile, consolidated their position. Engineers cleared more lanes through obstacles, while tanks and artillery moved inland to support infantry operations. Communications improved as surviving officers re-established control, linking small units into cohesive groups capable of advancing against remaining German resistance. The beachhead, once a narrow, precarious line on the sand, expanded steadily. Supplies flowed, reinforcements arrived, and morale, though battered by the day's horrors, remained resolute. The lessons learned about coordination, improvisation, and human endurance under fire would shape subsequent operations in Normandy and beyond. Casualties on both sides were severe, but the Americans had achieved a decisive objective. They held the beach. Thousands of soldiers had given their lives to turn a near-impossible landing into a foothold that would anchor the invasion of Western Europe. German losses were significant not only in manpower, but in morale and the integrity of their defensive positions. Omaha Beach, once a symbol of Nazi confidence and preparation, had become a testament to both the destructiveness of war and the power of relentless human effort. By the evening of June 6th, reports from the beach detailed the harrowing experiences of soldiers, the success of small unit initiatives, and the resilience of men under unimaginable conditions. Personal accounts described moments of courage, medics dragging the wounded through gunfire, soldiers scaling cliffs despite being pinned down, and engineers clearing obstacles with lives on the line. These narratives, often interwoven with tragedy, highlighted the human dimension of the battle, the mixture of fear, determination, and perseverance that defined the day. The aftermath of Omaha Beach set the stage for the broader Normandy campaign. German forces retreated to secondary defensive lines, attempting to regroup while facing relentless Allied pressure. The psychological shock of losing what was considered an impregnable position reverberated across the Atlantic Wall. For the Allies, the beachhead offered not only a strategic entry point into France, but also a symbol of what could be achieved despite overwhelming odds. The first wave had been decimated, the German machine gunners had laughed, but by the end of the day, Omaha Beach belonged to the Americans. In retrospect, the events of June 6th at Omaha Beach exemplify the brutal realities of war. Meticulous planning can fail, human courage can prevail, and the cost of victory is measured in lives lost. The beach, scarred by battle, would become both a graveyard and a testament, a place where the tides of history shifted, where the laughter of overconfidence was silenced by the relentless advance of thousands determined to survive and win. Omaha Beach remains etched in history as a testament to the extremes of human courage and endurance. In those hours, soldiers on both sides faced unimaginable horror. German machine gunners, trained and confident, confronted the unrelenting reality that no fortification could fully contain the human will to survive and fight. Their laughter at the first wave became a haunting memory, replaced by the heavy weight of disbelief and exhaustion. For the Americans, the beach was both a battlefield and a proving ground, where ordinary men became instruments of extraordinary determination, improvising under fire, supporting one another, and pushing forward despite near-certain death. The battle demonstrated that warfare is never solely a contest of weapons or fortifications. Technology, training, and planning set the stage, but human adaptability and resolve often decide the outcome. Omaha Beach was meticulously prepared to crush an invading army, yet the relentless tide of determination, soldiers crossing open sand, engineers clearing obstacles, officers leading from exposed positions, transformed a trap into a foothold. It showed that courage and improvisation, even against overwhelming firepower, could tip the scales in moments of decisive importance. Strategically, Omaha Beach marked a turning point in the liberation of Western Europe. By securing the beachhead, the Allies established the foundation for the Normandy campaign, a campaign that would eventually break the Atlantic Wall and force Germany into retreat on the Western Front. Psychologically, it shattered the myth of invincibility surrounding German defenses, demonstrating that even the most formidable positions could be overcome with persistence, coordination, and sacrifice. Omaha Beach is more than a military operation. It is a human story. It tells of fear confronted, courage discovered, and endurance tested beyond imagination. Each footprint in the sand, each weapon fired, each life lost, contributes to a narrative of resilience that transcends time. The laughter of the machine gunners has long faded, but the lesson endures. Preparation can delay, but determination drives history forward. In the quiet after the storm, as smoke cleared and the tide receded, The sand bore witness to the price paid and the victory earned. Omaha Beach became a symbol not just of D-Day, but of the extraordinary capacity of human beings to confront the impossible, survive, and forge the path to freedom through courage, unity, and relentless resolve.